to introduce and welcome one of our own acclaimed person who is in our community in Southern California, and he's amongst us. I've been trying to invite him and attend our program for the last 3 years. Finally, I was successful to bring him over here. Dr. Varun Soni. He is the Dean of Religious Life at the University of Southern California. And he's also Vice Provost of Campus Wellness and Crisis Intervention, Adjunct Professor of Religious Introduction, but I can have him over here. Prior to joining at USC, he taught at law school, law and society program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he studied. He's also a public speaker, has been invited by many news channels, TV programs, and is Dr. Varun Soni. Thank you. It's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate that enthusiastic introduction. I wish my wife was so enthusiastic when she saw me. But, so nice to be with you all today. Especially grateful to all of you for inviting me to this very special occasion, the 150th birthday of Mahatma Gandhi. It's really auspicious for me to be here with you at the Jain Center. As you all know, Jainism has always been a minority religion in India and in the world, small in terms of total numbers, but huge in terms of total impact. And I just got to say right now, there's nothing more important than ahimsa. There's nothing more important in this world. There's nothing we need to focus on more. Not just in terms of cultivating peace between each other, not just in terms of thinking about peace between all sentient beings, but especially and most importantly, to think about nonviolence towards the earth itself. You all know that we are facing a potential mass extinction event with catastrophic climate change. We have not treated the earth like our mother. We have not been good stewards of the planet in the way that we would hope for our grandchildren and their children to be. And in many ways, I think we've failed our children and our grandchildren. And so my hope is that, especially young people who are here today, can take this idea of ahimsa, which is so important for the world. It's not just a Jain idea anymore. It has to be a global idea. And think about what nonviolence means towards the planet, what nonviolence means towards each other, what nonviolence means towards animals. Only if we fully embrace ahimsa, I think, can we really flourish and thrive as a human civilization, as a human family. I want all of you to think about yourselves in this critical time, not just as Jain leaders, but as global leaders. Because the message that you've embodied and promoted throughout your life can't just remain in this room, can't just remain within this community, can't just remain within India. It has to be a global message. And there's no one better to be advocates of ahimsa, no one better to be ambassadors of nonviolence than all of you. So you do this work on behalf of the world, but we're at a point where we all need to really do this work together. I'm very excited to be here, like I said, to celebrate Gandhi. When I was born in India, but I was raised in the United States. My parents were already living in the United States. My mom went back to India to have me so she could be close to her family. So I was like the reverse anchor baby. And then I came here when I was 6 weeks old. So I'm basically ABCD, even though I was born in India, I was raised in the United States. So for those of you who don't know, ABCD is American Born Confused Desi. So I was American Born Confused Desi, although today I feel like the young Indian Americans are American Born Confident Desis. We were confused. We were confused. We were confused because we were the first generation of Indian Americans, or Hindu Americans, to be born and raised in the United States. Of course, we had the early Sikh migration at the turn of the century. But between 1924 and 1965, Indians were not allowed to immigrate to the United States and naturalize as citizens. So we had 40 years of Asiatic exclusion, 40 years where we couldn't be in this country. In 1965, with the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, suddenly the doors opened, and Indians could come and immigrate to the United States. And so my parents were part of that early migration. They came here in the 70s, when we got to the United States, there were very few Indians here. I was raised not too far from here, Newport Beach, stone's throw from here. I was always the only brown kid in every class. I was always the only Hindu in every class. I was always the kid who had the funny family and the funny name compared to all of my peers. That was difficult growing up. We didn't have any role models. We had Deepak Chopra and we had Apu from The Simpsons, and that was it. We had no one else. Our kids today have so many role models. There's so many Indian Americans who are doing so well in every field, whether it be entertainment or politics or whether it be tech or entrepreneurship. We had to be doctors or we had to be engineers. That was it. We had no other choice. I have 12 physicians in my family. My PhD in religion means nothing to any of them. No one calls me doctor. I had to marry a doctor to redeem myself, and even she doesn't call me doctor. So it's tough, you know, it's really tough because we were struggling to be American, and yet everyone saw us as Indian. And we didn't know what it meant to be Indian because we were born and raised in the US. When I went to go visit my family in India, I felt totally American. And when I came back to the United States, I felt totally Indian. But I didn't know what it meant to be either Indian or American. I didn't know what it meant to have any role models. So my grandparents moved in with us when I was about 5 or 6. And for the first time, through my grandfather, I began to have a sense of what it meant to be Indian, what it meant to be Hindu, what it meant to be a religious and ethnic minority, because my grandfather grew up at an extraordinary time, in an extraordinary way. His mother, Varun Soni, my great-grandmother, was very close with Kasturba Gandhi. They were partners in the Indian nationalist movement together. My great-grandmother inherited a lot of money because her husband died early. And instead of using that money to lavish herself with, you know, a big house and fancy clothes, she set up an orphanage and a shelter for battered women that still exists today in Dehradun. And she did that in the 1930s, right? So through that, she got to know Kasturba Gandhi really well. And they spent time in jail together. They were leaders of the women's wing of the Indian nationalist movement. And so my grandfather grew up around Gandhi. He used to tell me stories about how he would sit on his lap while he was giving lectures, how he would hang out with Gandhi and Nehru, how Nehru saw my great-grandmother as his own mother, and how he got caught up as a young boy in the excitement of the Indian nationalist movement and as a young man. So when my grandfather started telling me these stories, I began to look to Gandhi as the example of what it meant to be an Indian, or what it meant to be Hindu, or what it meant to translate one's values into action. And around the same time, the movie Gandhi came out. You probably all remember that. That was the first time I got to see my family story, my community, my people depicted in a positive way, not as a terrorist, not as, you know, sort of the emasculated, person who needed sort of the white savior, but actually as a strong brown Indian man who my family had a relationship with, being portrayed as a hero, right? That was really powerful for me to see that we could have that kind of story, to see other Americans respect our story for a change as opposed to us just respecting American stories. And so having that experience with my grandfather talking to me about Gandhi, seeing the film Gandhi, really had a deep impact in my life. And now when I look at my life, I realize I followed Gandhi's example, even though I didn't really choose to. He was a lawyer, I'm a lawyer. He was a scholar of religion, so am I. He was an interfaith activist, so am I. He lived in India and South Africa, so did I. It wasn't something I intentionally planned on doing, but I think those seeds were planted deep and in a profound way that they just sort of grew up over time, and I am very much, who I am because of Gandhi. About 12, 13 years ago, I was in Rio in a nightclub. It seems like a strange way to talk about Gandhi, but I met this young woman from South Africa, and I started talking to her about growing up in South Africa. She was Indian, and I started talking to her about her family story and what it was like being Indian growing up in South Africa. And she told me that her great-great-grandparents worked with Gandhi in South Africa, that her great-great-grandparents were part of the early Satyagraha movement in a place called Phoenix Settlement, which was outside of Durban. And that we had this incredible conversation in Rio about Gandhi, about how my great-grandparents worked with him in India, and how her great-great-grandparents worked with him in South Africa. That was the first time we met. That was the first conversation we had. And much to her dismay, she's now my wife. So Gandhi brought us together in a way that felt authentic to my own life and to her life. When I was hired as Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life about 12 years ago at USC, as you heard, I became the first Hindu in American history to be the chief religious or spiritual leader of a university. All my colleagues around the country are ordained Protestant ministers, and USC hired me, a non-ordained Hindu attorney. So it was totally outside the box. It was 2008. Barack Obama was running for president, so it was finally a good time to be a kid with a funny name and an unusual story. But the reason I was hired, according to one of my friends, was that he said Christians love Hindu attorneys because many Christians believe Gandhi, more than anyone, represented the Christian value of love your enemy. And because he was a Hindu attorney, he said the Christians on the committee trusted you because you were also part of that lineage. So now, all these years later, I realize I have Gandhi to thank for my job and for my wife and for my life. So I've studied Gandhi since I was in college. That was when I took my first class on Gandhi. And the way I was raised was that Gandhi was a saint, that he was an apostle of nonviolence, and that India is fundamentally shaped as a nonviolent country because of who Gandhi was. But the more I studied, the more I realized that it was way more complex and nuanced than that, and that we did him a great disservice by calling him a saint. Even he himself didn't want to be called Mahatma. He wasn't very comfortable with that kind of adoration. Why? Because he was an imperfect being, and in this day and age, with imperfect beings, we cancel them, we write them out. There's no room for reflection or redemption. But Gandhi was very open about his imperfection, and I think that should inspire all of us to be more like him. Because if you put him on a pedestal and say he's a saint, then there's no way for us to be like him. Okay, we admire him, we adore him in the same way we do the Dalai Lama and Albert Einstein and all these other people who are around the room. But if we realize he was a human who struggled like we struggled, then maybe we can be inspired towards greatness. Maybe imperfection isn't the barrier to greatness, maybe imperfection is the road to greatness. And so I think that we should think of him as a man, not just as a Mahatma. We should think of him as a human, not just as a saint. We should think about his history, not just his hagiography, in order to fully honor the person that he was, and in order to think about what that person means to us. There are some critics, and I want to sort of address these critiques, that say that Gandhi gets more credit than he deserves, that his legacy is not actually the one that we think of. And there's two particular perspectives that they talk about and that they sort of push back on. The first is the idea that Gandhi freed India through nonviolence. That's the way I was raised, that because of nonviolence, India was freed. It's a beautiful image of this man in a loincloth that he spun himself, standing up to this great British Empire. This great empire, the biggest, most mighty empire the world has ever seen, and an Indian man standing up to that empire and bringing it down. That's a beautiful image, but is it actually true? Did Gandhi's nonviolence actually free India? I think you can make the case that it wasn't actually Gandhi, and many people do. There are people who say it wasn't Gandhi who freed India, but Hitler. It wasn't the most nonviolent person of the 20th century who freed India, but actually the most violent person of the 20th century. Because as you know, Hitler bankrupted the British Empire through World War II. And when Britain left India in 1947, they left all of their colonies around the same time, not just India. And those colonies didn't have non-violent movements in the same way India did. It was just that they had no more money because Hitler had bankrupted them. And in fact, Gandhi had started Satyagraha in 1915, the Quit India movement, and achieved liberation in 1947. So that's a 32-year struggle of nonviolence, right? Whereas Gandhi's sort of contemporary, Subhash Chandra Bose, who preached a very different approach, who preached a violent insurrection, claimed that if 500 million people, Indians, had violently resisted British rule, there's no way 50,000 British could have lasted more than a week. That we could have gotten to independence in 1915, not 1947, that we could have gotten to independence in a way that didn't have a partition, which also caused a lot of grief and tragedy, and that we could have gotten to independence in a way that made India sort of stronger. So that's the critique, that maybe it wasn't nonviolence that led to the liberation of India, but violence. And maybe Gandhi's path was the longer path as opposed to Subhash Chandra Bose's path. We'll never know that. But that's one critique. The second critique is that in India, is not, people say India is a non-violent country because of Gandhi, but the reality, we all know this, India is not a non-violent country. We have a big army in India, we have massive defense spending, we have nuclear weapons, Kashmir is the largest militarized zone in the world. So even though Gandhi is literally on every rupee note, like you look at any note, whether it's whatever, 20, 100, 500, 1,000, Gandhi is on every note. It seems that Indians who love to celebrate Gandhi might not love to celebrate his message of nonviolence as much, right? Even recently, Prime Minister Modi went to the UAE to celebrate Gandhi's 150th birthday, and how did they celebrate it? Have you seen this video? They celebrated it with a military parade. I was like, really? Do you think that's what Gandhi would have wanted? A military exercise, a show of military might to celebrate his legacy? But it didn't seem like anyone saw any kind of tension in that. I thought that was really, telling of the fact that India loves Gandhi, but not necessarily Gandhiism. India is the home to more poor people than any country in the world. We've done great jobs since 1991, since economic liberalization. We've lifted 300 million people out of poverty. It's amazing, but we still have 300 million people who live under $2 a day in India. And Gandhi said that the most extreme form of violence is poverty. So according to Gandhi's own logic, if India has more poor people than any country in the world, then maybe India is the most violent country in the world, not the most non-violent. So here are some critiques about Gandhi, critiques that maybe nonviolence didn't take hold in India in the way that we hoped, critiques that maybe Gandhi's strategy of nonviolence wasn't as effective as perhaps Subhash Chandra Bose's, a critique that maybe Gandhi wasn't as important to the liberation of India as Hitler, who, one is a saint and one is the devil. I disagree with those critiques, and I want to tell you why. I disagree with those critiques because even if they're true, let's just assume they're true, and we know that, at least in the case of India being non-violent, we have a long way to go. So let's assume all this is true. That doesn't mean Gandhi was wrong. Because what Gandhi talked about was a spiritual approach to non-violence, in the same way that Martin Luther King did, and the same way that Dalai Lama does. And what that means is that the process is as important as the goal. The way you get to the place is as important as the place itself. The beauty is in the walking. We're blinded by the destination. So what Gandhi was teaching us was not that we had to get to a particular place, but that we had to get there in a particular way. He believed that if you started the country with nonviolence, the country would be nonviolent. If you started the country with violence, the country would be violent. Whatever seeds you plant, that's what grows. Martin Luther King, who was his greatest follower, in my opinion, Martin Luther King said, hate cannot dispel hate. Only love can dispel hate. Darkness cannot dispel darkness. Only light can dispel darkness. Hate is as injurious to the person who hates as it is to the person who is hated. So if we are violent, and if we are hateful, then that is as bad for us as it is for others. Because we carry that around. We carry around negative emotions. We carry around a closed heart. We carry around a consciousness of violence. That deteriorates us. And if we are deteriorated, then how can we be the change that we want to see in the world? So for Gandhi, even though people critique his legacy of nonviolence, I think he would look at it and say, that's not actually what I was saying. What I was saying is that the process is important. Because remember, what Gandhi taught us was that the way we transform our world is by transforming ourselves. We have to do inner work. Satyagraha is about inner work. So what he led was a movement of people doing inner work. And collectively, by transforming the individual, society was transformed, right? That's the important work that doesn't happen when you're violent or hateful. That's the difficult work. That's sadhana. That's a spiritual discipline. So I disagree with those critiques. I think that if we're really to take Gandhi's message seriously, we start with ourselves. We start with the work of our own heart. Gandhi used to talk about the Gita, and some people would say, listen, the Gita is a violent text. Krishna is telling Arjuna to go kill his cousins. Why shouldn't we go kill the British? That's what a lot of Hindu nationalists were saying at the time. And Gandhi said, no, the battle that's happening is not the battle of the battlefield. It's the battle of your own heart. And the Kurukshetra, the battlefield, is happening inside of you, right? And that the great challenge is to slay your own demons and to find your own light, not in the world, but inside of yourself. There's a very similar concept in in Islam, jihad. A lot of people think of jihad as a holy war. That's not true. Jihad is the inner struggle. Jihad is the war in your own heart. And we all struggle with that war in our own heart. And I think that's Gandhi's great legacy and gift to us. Another thing I think we should all think about, because we're Indian American, is Gandhi's legacy for Indian Americans. Of course, Gandhi never visited the United States. So it seems, like how could he be a role model for us? We're so technologically connected and sophisticated and etc. And Gandhi seems to be this village ascetic. Well, first of all, remember Churchill called Gandhi a half-naked fakir. But let's not forget who Gandhi actually was. Gandhi was a British educated lawyer who lived and worked and practiced on 3 different continents. He was very cosmopolitan. He was very global. He was very connected in the world. He wasn't just a mystic, saint who lived outside the world. That's why he was so smart at his political organizing, right? So Gandhi does offer to us a vision of what it means to be a global citizen, because he himself was a global citizen in the way that we are also, connecting India and the United States. And what we can do in the United States, which is unique, I think, in the world, is learn from everyone, learn to love everyone. We are in a pluralistic society. We know people from every walk of life. I work in Los Angeles. That's the most religiously diverse city in human history. As the chaplain of the university, I oversee 90 different student religious groups. I oversee 60 chaplains of every faith. I have more students from India than any school in the country, and when they come to campus, they meet students from 140 different countries, right? This is the place where the whole world gets together and learns from each other. And Gandhi modeled what that looks like. Let's not forget, Gandhi was deeply inspired by the Christian Beatitudes. The most important book in his life outside the Gita was the Sermon on the Mount. The most important teaching was Jesus' love your enemy and turn the other cheek. That meant as much to him as any Hindu teaching, right? And that's a Christian tradition. Let's not forget that Gandhi was the epitome of the Jain idea of ahimsa, right? He grew up in Gujarat, he grew up with Jain neighbors, Jain friends, and he fully embraced ahimsa, fully embraced that idea in a way that very few Hindus did at the time, right? And he, in some ways, was a champion of Jainism through his love and his embodiment of ahimsa. Let's not forget that Gandhi himself was deeply influenced by the Muslim pillar of zakat, of charitable giving. He encouraged everyone to do seva, to give back, to support communities, right? Let's not forget that Gandhi himself was trained in the law, but was also a spiritualist. He didn't see a difference between spirituality and science and between the ancient and the contemporary world. He tried to integrate them all in a way that made sense of a larger whole. So Gandhi gives us a bridge to pluralistic thinking. And as Indian Americans, we have the responsibility and the privilege to model that kind of pluralistic thinking, right? So I think all of us, in our own journey, in our own migration stories, in our own desires to bring together the best of India and the United States, the best of the world's religions, and still be true to who we are in terms of our own faith and our own values, there is no better example of that than Gandhi. And so 150 years later, Gandhi was born just a few years after the American Civil War. And yet, 150 years later, his legacy to us as Indian Americans is profound, it's deep, it's enduring. And so when we talk to Gandhi about with our children, our grandchildren, it's this model of inclusivity, of empathy, of mutual respect. I don't like the word tolerance, I gotta say. Who wants to be tolerated? That seems like a low bar, I tolerate you. That's a very low bar. I think we have to move to respect, right? And love. That's the higher consciousness. That's the higher aspiration. That's the legacy of Gandhi, beyond tolerance, to respect, to engagement, to love. So, as we think about Gandhi on this auspicious day at this auspicious place, let's think about how we can be the change that we want to see in the world. Let's not just assume that our job is to change the world. Let's realize that our real privilege is to change ourselves. And as we change ourselves, we light that light within us, that light of divinity, that light of Buddha, that light of Mahavira, that light of realization, that light of accomplishment, that light of higher consciousness. And like other candles, we can then light the light within each of us. We can be the candle that lights the flame with the community that we love and care about. And by modeling that, and we need that, we need leaders who model ethical behavior. We don't have very many in this day and age. We need to do it in our communities, we need to do it in our homes, we need to do it in our society. And Gandhi gives us the way to do that. So thank you all for inviting me here. I really appreciated this opportunity. And
Very
very much. Gandhiji is not here to defend himself or defend against the critics, but who could be a better person than a religious attorney to defend him? I am very confident that Gandhiji will defend him from wherever he is. Thank you. And Dr. Soni mentioned that he is benefited by Gandhiji having wife, having life, having job. But it's not only him who benefited, all of us. Not only one, but all of us are benefited because of his work.